Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, after my last video where I responded to Team 3D Alpha, I thought the internet was finally safe from DHT simps. As a hair loss witcher, I know of course that it is my job to slay the DHT grave hags by dispelling the propaganda from DHT simps across the internet whose misinformation emboldens the slaphead curse by scaring people away from treatments like Finasteride. I know it is of course inevitable that every now and then some big video simping for DHT will come out from a big channel, but usually after I respond and debunk it, there is a period of calm that lasts at least a few months where the internet begins to finally settle down and think more rationally about hair loss treatments, and the Finasteride fear-mongering isn't being amplified by any big influential voices. This period of calm is beneficial for me and the hair loss community at large, since it gives me the opportunity to stop focusing on dispelling myths about existing treatments so I can use my time to examine the latest research on future hair loss treatments. This time though, the DHT simps, they are being extra aggressive as we now have a new video out from the channel called Nutrition Library, and it came out just a few days after my last video responding to Team 3D Alpha. Now, I have to be honest, I don't particularly enjoy doing these response videos because, like I said, I don't like revisiting outdated and obsolete myths about Finasteride and hair loss that I've already debunked several times already. I prefer to look forward to the future. Sadly though, when a channel with a lot of influence and followers starts spreading misinformation about hair loss treatments, I really have no choice but to intervene because otherwise the panic will spread, and unless I respond, things will spiral completely out of control to the point where nobody knows what to believe anymore. So, when big channels start gaslighting about the subject of hair loss by making hyperbolic claims that DHT is some super important hormone or that Finasteride is too dangerous of a treatment to consider, that kind of sensationalist rhetoric needs to be dispelled or else it will put people's hair at risk. I know this because I am someone who delayed treatment myself because of similar fear-mongering back in the day, and it took me 2 hair transplants as well as nearly $15,000 to recover even a semblance of my original hairline. If I had access to good information back then, that would have never have happened. That is why I am here. I want to be the person who I wish was around when I was a young man who was first losing his hair. Basically, I just want to be someone who can set the record straight on what the science actually says about hair loss as well as the safety of hair loss treatments. So, to start off with, this video isn't nearly as bad as the Team 3D Alpha video. In the case of Nutrition Library, even though he's obviously biased in favor of DHT, I can tell he actually did his research on the subject and he's not nearly as dogmatic about the hormone. In fact, maybe calling him a DHT simp is a little bit too strong of a term. Perhaps he's just more DHT curious.
So DHT gets a ton of hate online, mainly because of its role in male pattern baldness. One scroll through the front page of Google and you'll see tons of articles outlining different methods and ways to decrease levels of DHT for the purpose of keeping your hair. And now listen, I get it. I want to keep my hair as well. However, in this video, what I want to do is essentially make the case that DHT isn't all that bad, and on the contrary, might actually be good. So let's go ahead and dive right in.
So we are not hearing the usual hyperbolic nonsense we always hear from DHT simps. We don't hear him saying something like DHT is a better hormone than testosterone or that Finasteride will chemically castrate you, and we certainly don't hear him saying something like DHT will turn you into a Super Saiyan in order to pander to the insecurities of anime fans who are on the fence about taking Finasteride. He's basically just saying something along the lines of, look, I know this is a controversial subject, but maybe, just maybe, DHT isn't as bad as people like Kevin say it is. So let's go over some research on this. In fact, I think it is possible that he actually set out to create this video with a more pro-DHT slant, but he then moderated his position upon actually critically examining the research. So I don't think this guy is hopelessly in love with DHT the way 3D Alpha is. Instead, I think he realized that his initial impressions about DHT were not as strongly supported as he might have thought, and honestly, that's how I used to be too. Way back in the day when I was going bald, I spent way too much time on shitty hair loss forums dominated by internet internet tough guys, and I actually believed their DHT simping rhetoric because I really didn't know any better. Upon doing the research, though, my positions eventually changed because I discovered that the weight of evidence does not support the fear-mongering about DHT or the reverence so many DHT simps have about the trash hormone. So like I said, this video isn't all bad, and there is some stuff I agree with here, especially at the beginning, but he sadly goes off the rails later in the video, and he makes some bogus claims as well as uncritically cites a bunch of bullshit research, and I'll go over all of that. But before I do want to hear some of the facts he says about DHT that I actually do agree with.
So DHT, otherwise known as dihydrotestosterone, is an androgenic sex steroid whose production is catalyzed by the enzyme 5-alpha reductase from the hormone testosterone, but can also be produced through what has been termed the backdoor pathway, whereby DHT is produced from the conversion of progesterone into DHT instead of testosterone into DHT.
So he gives us a good breakdown of the biochemistry of DHT, including its creation from testosterone through the 5-AR pathway, as well as via some of the lesser-known backdoor pathways. Besides these multiple pathways to create DHT, there are also two major isoenzymes of the 5-AR enzyme for the creation of DHT, which he doesn't talk much about. The important point is that with these multiple DHT creation pathways and multiple 5-AR isoenzymes, it is impossible to completely eliminate DHT in the body with medications. So even if there were some hypothetical minor role that hasn't been discovered that DHT plays in the adult human body, it is plausible that that need is already being met with the residual DHT that is produced even when on a drug like dutasteride that suppresses 95% of serum DHT. If that wasn't the case, then pretty much everyone taking dutasteride would be suffering from a DHT deficiency and would have whatever symptoms a critical lack of DHT would produce. Clearly that's not the case though, since the vast majority of men can take dutasteride without any side effects whatsoever.
Now, when compared to testosterone, DHT appears to have a 2 to 3 times stronger binding affinity for the androgen receptor, and also appears to disassociate from the androgen receptor about 5 times slower than testosterone, and because of this, is considered to be about 5 to 10 times more potent than testosterone.
He talks about the interaction between DHT and the androgen receptor and how it compares to testosterone. DHT has biochemical properties that make it more potent than testosterone, and he could have easily gone off the rails right here by saying something like, "See, look how much better DHT is." But fortunately, he isn't deceptive here. He puts the research into perspective by actually showing the role DHT plays in the body versus testosterone. Specifically, he points out the fact that DHT works as a paracrine hormone instead of as an endocrine hormone the way testosterone does.
Now, one of the reasons that DHT doesn't get nearly as much love as its younger brother testosterone is because, yes, of its probable role in male pattern baldness, but also because it primarily operates as a paracrine hormone as opposed to an endocrine hormone like testosterone.
So what that means is that DHT as it exists naturally in the body does not play any role outside of the select tissues where it is predominantly produced by the 5-AR enzyme, such as the scalp, skin, and prostate, where of course it only does bad things like cause hair loss, give us acne, and enlarge our prostate. So even though DHT is a more potent steroid than testosterone is, it doesn't do anything better than testosterone because it only has effects in tissues where it is produced, which are tissues where there is a lot of 5-AR enzyme activity. There are a lot of tissues that have little or no 5-AR enzyme activity, and that includes skeletal muscle where the primary androgenic hormone is circulating testosterone and not DHT. Now, it is of course important to recognize that we're only talking about DHT in levels that exist naturally in our bodies. We're not talking about using supplemental DHT like DHT-based steroids such as Anadrol, Masteron, or Winstrol. Giving the body a superphysiological amount of any androgen, whether it is testosterone or DHT, will have a positive effect on strength and athletic performance, but that is not the role that DHT serves as it exists naturally in the body, since 5-AR activity is virtually non-existent in skeletal muscle tissue. DHT's actions in the body are limited to just the tissues where 5-AR is produced, which again include the scalp, prostate, and skin, and not the skeletal muscle.
Because muscle tissue and fat tissue are very poor expressors of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, very little DHT is active in these tissues, and therefore DHT is a really poor anabolic and fat loss agent, which is why no one really likes it.
So he further illustrates my point here, which is that DHT is not a strength-building hormone, at least not in the levels that exist naturally, and I am glad he brought this up, because a lot of DHT simps seem to conveniently forget that just because you take something like Anadrol, for instance, which is a DHT-based steroid, and it makes you strong, that doesn't automatically mean that the DHT your body produces also makes you strong. Testosterone is the major hormone for strength and anabolism, not DHT. Nutrition Library makes a strong case for this, which I completely agree with.
Because DHT is 5 to 10 times more potent at activating and continuing to activate the androgen receptor, there may be some level of endocrine function to DHT that really hasn't been identified yet.
So he is speculating here, and it's possible he's even right, but remember what we went over earlier about the backdoor pathways. Serum DHT will continue to be produced even with the suppression of the 5-AR enzyme. So even if he is right that there is some endocrinological role DHT plays that hasn't been discovered yet, it is very likely that that role, whatever it may be, is already being met through those backdoor pathways. So if there is a critical unknown role for serum DHT in the body, we can assume that the very small amount of DHT provided by backdoor pathways is all that is necessary in order to fulfill that role. And as I said earlier, it's not possible to suppress all of your DHT.
Now, when it comes to the roles of DHT in the body, its most well-established role is that of its role in the sexual differentiation of the male sexual organs during fetal development, as well as to some degree during puberty.
And then he talks about DHT's role during fetal development and during early adolescence, which again isn't anything contentious at all. Even though I have always said that DHT is a trash hormone, I have contextualized that by emphasizing that this applies to people who are past puberty. If you were to ask me if DHT is a trash hormone in fetuses, infants, or children, I would of course say no, and that they shouldn't suppress DHT.
And a lot of this understanding comes from the research of individuals that are born with a 5-alpha reductase deficiency. These men are often born with highly underdeveloped male genitalia and are often considered to be pseudohermaphrodites at birth. But what's interesting is that most of these men have completely normal amounts of muscle mass, which further demonstrates the lackluster potential of DHT as an anabolic agent. When you look at twins where one has a 5-alpha reductase deficiency and the other doesn't, they both have very similar physiques in terms of muscle mass and fat mass. However, what's even more interesting about these men that have a 5-alpha reductase deficiency is when they go through puberty, they typically also experience a normal male puberty experience, an increase in libido, an increase in sexual function, as well as just a general increase in the masculinization process, which goes to show you that testosterone is not just the primary driver for muscle mass and fat loss, but also for just the general masculinization process that occurs at puberty. Now, even though you do see somewhat normal puberty and normal muscle mass and fat mass in individuals that have no DHT, one thing you do not see in these individuals is male pattern baldness, which is why DHT is so famous for its role in hair loss.
What he's talking about here is the research from Dr. Julian Imperato-McGinley on the Dominican Republic pseudohermaphrodites who were born with a type 2 5-AR isoenzyme deficiency which impaired their development, but during puberty they would develop normal sexual function and their sex organs would grow to normal size. Their muscular development was also no different from people without a 5-AR deficiency, which shows that DHT is not important for strength and sexual health after puberty. The real important observation about these individuals that Dr. Imperato made, though, was that none of these men with a genetic 5-AR deficiency ever went bald, and they also never developed an enlarged prostate. This research served as the foundation for the development of finasteride in order to treat hair loss as well as an enlarged prostate. The only other difference in development in these men lacking the type 2 5-AR enzyme was that they lacked facial hair. So that means that DHT is important for beard development during puberty. However, once you develop a beard, the suppression of androgens, whether it is testosterone or DHT, will not suppress facial hair growth. We know this because even male to female trans women still need to get electrolysis in order to remove their facial hair, despite nearly completely suppressing their testosterone and DHT levels with androgen blockers, in addition to taking taking estrogen. The role of androgens on beard development post-puberty is a bit more of a nuanced subject, but it does appear that testosterone plays a more important role than DHT does, with the latter only being important for the rate of growth as opposed to beard density. I don't want to get too off topic though, so I'll go ahead and link my video on finasteride and beard growth below so we can continue this video.
Now, the role of DHT in male pattern baldness has been confirmed through several other lines of reasoning and several other lines of evidence. However, as outlined in this paper, the exact role that 5-alpha reductase in DHT plays in hair loss isn't exactly clear yet.
Whoa, wait a second. Did I see what I think I just saw? Let's rewind a bit.
Other lines of reasoning and several other lines of evidence. However,
as outlined in this paper.
Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Rob England? Rob motherfucking England? Medical hypotheses? Are you kidding me, bro? I mean, I know you're familiar with my content, so are you meaning to tell me that you've never seen my Rob England videos? First of all, as is fitting for a medical editor like Rob England, this sorry excuse for a study was published in the bargain basement medical journal known as Medical Hypotheses, which is ranked as the worst scientific journal in the Milky Way galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, and whatever galaxy Star Wars takes place in. Medical Hypotheses is so bad, it is literally the Ray Peat forum of medical journals. It is most notorious for publishing bogus research such as this article that denied that AIDS was due to the HIV virus, which the journal was forced to retract. The founder of the journal is quoted as saying, quote, "The primary criteria for acceptance are very different from the usual journals. In essence, what I look for are the answers to two questions only. Is there some biological plausibility to what the author is saying? Is the paper readable? We are not looking at whether or not the paper is true, but merely at whether it is interesting," unquote. So by interesting, what he means is whether or not you're willing to fork over the $1,800 that is required to get whatever pile of trash you want to be published. It is basically just a business that serves to help give a veneer of legitimacy to people who want to use bogus science to promote whatever scam they want to profit from, which is why even an idiot like Paul Taylor was able to get his laughably stupid paper on skull expansion published in it. And I made a video on Paul Taylor and his stupid skull expansion theory, which I'll link below if you want to see it. And Rob England, he did the same thing with this study. Most people do not have the scientific literacy in order to ascertain the quality of a scientific journal, so they'll just see that the research is published in this journal and then they'll assume that it is good research. Now, when it comes to Rob England, oh boy, there is no way I could cover all this drama in this video, so I'll link my videos I made about him below. But to summarize the purpose of this article, Rob is basically just trying to promote his business, which is based on the fraudulent, obsolete, pseudoscientific theory known as the blood flow theory. The focal point of Rob's business is that it is possible to treat hair loss without the use of drugs, which of course isn't true, but it makes for an effective business model since there are a lot of people who are afraid to take finasteride, largely in part thanks to videos like this one from Nutrition Library, as well as Team 3D Alpha Squad's recent video, which I covered in the last video. So, going over Rob's bullshit, the crux of his theory is that tense scalp muscles cause tightening of the connective tissue on the scalp called the gallia aponeurotica. This tension inhibits blood flow, which interferes with hair growth either by causing low oxygen levels, which either kills the hair follicles directly, or in the updated version of the blood flow theory, it upregulates the 5-AIR enzyme and generates DHT that kills the hair follicles. The whole scalp tension blood flow theory is 100% completely wrong, not just in practice, but even the theory is completely fallacious. There is a ton of information I have debunked about this, which is why I strongly encourage everybody to watch my Rob England videos, especially the one where he collabs with what I've learned. I'll just briefly summarize some of the positions with the blood flow theory and why it's wrong. Number 1. The blood vessels of the scalp do not run underneath either the scalp muscles or the gallia aponeurotica. They run in the loose, fatty connective tissue that is just underneath the skin and above the scalp muscles and gallia aponeurotica, so any tension wouldn't influence blood flow. Number 2, the arterial networks of the scalp are redundant, as you can see in this image right here. What that means is that even if there were tension blocking off an artery, the blood flow would just increase in the other arteries, which would result in the same amount of blood flow to the scalp. scalp. To further prove this, there is a common cosmetic surgical procedure where people who don't like the way the superficial temporal artery looks on their temples can have that artery ligated, which means tied off. The superficial temporal artery supplies blood to the scalp, but even if it is tied off completely, there is no hair loss because the other blood vessels make up for it. This is even noted by surgeons who perform this ligation surgery. Number 3. Low oxygen levels of the scalp have never been definitively proven to even cause hair loss on the scalp to begin with. On the contrary, there is even evidence that hypoxic scalp environments, meaning low oxygen, can even stimulate hair growth by stimulating stem cell proliferation. There is even a hair growth stimulant on the market today called stamoxetine, which works through this very mechanism. Number 4, massages in general don't even improve blood flow to begin with. In fact, a study was done that looked at the effects of manual massages on both the large muscle, the quadriceps, as well as on the small muscles of the forearms that showed that manual massages had no impact on blood flow, and this was confirmed by using a Doppler, which is a device that measures the velocity of blood flow using ultrasound. Again though, this wouldn't matter even if massages did work, because in the case of the scalp, the vascular networks that support the hair follicles run above the muscles, so tense muscles wouldn't be an issue regardless. Number 5, low oxygen levels in bald scalps are a consequence, not a cause of hair loss. When hair follicles are lost, the capillaries that supply blood to the hair follicles are lost as well, and the hair follicles get replaced by scar tissue, which is avascular, meaning it has no blood flow. Number 6, this theory was already debunked literally 107 years ago. A hair loss pioneer named Dorothy Osborn published her first paper establishing a link between hair loss and genetics way back in 1916. The prevailing theory before this was that tight hats caused hair loss in men because back then almost all men wore hats and the hair bands were very tight in order to prevent them from being blown off in the wind. Dorothy Osborn, however, showed that the pattern of hair loss did not match the constriction of the hat band, and then she showed that hair loss was an inherited trait, with people being more likely to express the trait if they had a parent who had hair loss. So, even before we had the tools to measure things like hormones, we already knew that the blood flow theory was complete bullshit. So the blood flow theory is so bad that it is downright impressive in how it manages to get everything so horrifically wrong, but that of course doesn't stop snake oil salesman grifters like Rob England, Hairguard, and Paul Taylor from promoting it. I, of course, just touched the tip of the iceberg here as to why this theory is so wrong, so make sure you watch my Rob England and blood flow videos linked below in order to learn why the blood flow theory, as well as all the derivative theories surrounding it, like the school expansion theory, the dental malocclusion theory, and the theory that explains everything, are all completely false.
There is still a lot of unanswered questions. For one, if DHT is the root cause of male pattern baldness, why do DHT levels decrease with age while the risk of balding increases with age? Why is there no association between DHT levels and the risk of balding? If DHT is the root cause of male pattern baldness, you would expect men with higher levels of DHT to also experience higher rates of male pattern baldness, but this is just not what you see. Well, one might say, well, it's not exactly DHT levels per se, but more so an increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase, as well as DHT specifically in the scalp, and this is likely true. However, what is it that actually causes this increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase? And why is it that an increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase in other areas of the skin, like the face and the chest, actually cause an increase in hair growth? And why is it that only certain parts of the scalp seem to be sensitive to DHT? How is it that only some hair follicle androgen receptors become sensitive to DHT, but not others? And then what is the exact role of genetics in all of this? There have been numerous studies that have identified several genes strongly associated with an increase of male pattern baldness, the most relevant being the identification of a very specific androgen receptor gene. However, the exact role of this gene and the effects that it has on the androgen receptors in the scalp and in the rest of the body for that matter aren't exactly known. And so I don't say all of this to discount the effect that DHT has in male pattern baldness, but just to say that there's just a lot that hasn't been answered yet.
So this guy asks all these questions like there's some big mystery, but the truth is that there are simple answers to all of these questions. Everything he's bringing up has been very well investigated and explained, so he's giving the impression that there are a lot of unexplained phenomenon about hair loss, and this is a common tactic with a lot of snake oil salesmen because it allows them to introduce their own bizarre theories as alternatives to conventional therapies like finasteride. But let's go ahead and run through the questions and give some answers.
For one, if DHT is the root cause of male pattern baldness, why do DHT levels decrease with age while the risk of balding increases with age?
First of all, it isn't known for certain that DHT even does decrease with age. There are some studies that show it actually increases with age, but even if it doesn't, there is another factor that causes hair loss in older men. It is called senescent alopecia, which is a different type of hair loss that can either stack with androgenic alopecia or be completely independent of it. Like androgenic alopecia, senescent alopecia is also inherited as a genetic trait, which explains why some old people never go bald at all. Senescent alopecia is not due to DHT, and it is not as well understood or well studied as androgenic alopecia, but since it is not related to DHT, any decrease of DHT levels in old age would not influence its progression. So DHT levels with old age are completely irrelevant since as men get older, they face additional hair loss problems that can cause hair loss on their own. And this is even assuming DHT levels drop in older men to begin with, which is far from an established fact. And I have a couple videos that deal with this very subject that I'll link below. One is a video on senescent alopecia that I just mentioned, but the other is a video on DHT's effects on skin health, but that video includes research which shows that DHT may increase with age, which may be a factor in aging skin, and may be another thing which explains why hair loss gets worse with age since DHT may actually increase. You can have low testosterone and still go bald if you have enough 5-air activity after all. I mean, just look at this new male right here. Does he really look like he has high testosterone? Of course he doesn't.
Why is there no association between DHT levels and the risk of balding? If DHT is the root cause of male pattern baldness, you would expect men with higher levels of DHT to also experience higher rates of male pattern baldness, but this is just not what you see.
It's because DHT needs to be in the scalp in order to cause baldness. The serum DHT levels really don't matter. Nutritionist Library already made the point that serum DHT levels are very low and probably don't have any function. He also made the point that DHT is a paracrine hormone, meaning it works where it is produced, so it of course is no surprise that hair loss does not correlate with serum DHT levels, and that is because that isn't where DHT is produced. It is produced in the hair follicles where it does damage directly to the hair follicles, so the only thing that is relevant here is scalp DHT, and people with androgenic alopecia have far higher scalp DHT levels than people who don't have androgenic alopecia. So actually, baldness does correlate with DHT levels when you're looking at DHT levels in the scalp, but these scalp DHT levels don't correlate with serum DHT levels.
Well, one might say, well, it's not exactly DHT levels per se, but more so an increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase, as well as DHT specifically in the scalp. And this is likely true. However, what is it that actually causes this increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase? And why is it that an increase in the expression of 5-alpha reductase in other areas of the skin, like the face and the chest, actually cause an increase in hair growth? And why is it that only certain parts of the scalp seem to be sensitive to DHT? How is it that only some hair follicle androgen receptors become sensitive to DHT, but not others? And then what is the exact role of genetics in all of this? There have been numerous studies that have identified several genes strongly associated with an increase of male pattern baldness, the most relevant being the identification of a very specific androgen receptor gene. However, the exact role of this gene and the effects that it has on the androgen receptors in the scalp and in the rest of the body for that matter aren't exactly known. And so I don't say all of this to discount the effect that DHT has in male pattern baldness, but just to say that there's just a lot that hasn't been answered yet.
So what's the common theme here with all these questions? He's asking questions that all have the same answer. It's genetics, dude! So he mentions the androgen paradox, which is the supposed mystery as to why androgens promote beard growth but cause hair loss at the scalp. Well, It turns out this paradox isn't as big of a mystery as many people think it is. As we already discussed, DHT's role in male development is different at different stages of life. Beard development occurs during puberty, so at this point, DHT stimulates the formation of hair follicles in the face, but in adulthood, DHT is no longer important, as I mentioned, which is why every male to female trans woman still requires electrolysis in order to remove their facial hair. So this whole androgen paradox thing is something that only occurs during like 5 years or so of our life, and then it no longer applies at all. If you're in late adolescence or in adulthood, then this whole DHT paradox discussion is completely irrelevant. As to why there is an excessive amount of the 5-AR enzyme or abnormal androgen receptors in the hair follicles of balding men, well, that's also just genetics. Also, as to why hair loss commonly occurs in the Norwood pattern that we usually see, this is just due to genetic determinism. The majority of people who are going bald will have a greater density of 5-AR activity and androgen receptor density in the pattern that we see typically associated with the Norwood scale, but this isn't always the case. There are forms of androgenic alopecia where people will lose hair in a diffuse pattern, or in some cases, they will even lose hair on the sides and back of their scalp first. This is called retrograde alopecia, and it isn't as common as the Norwood pattern, but it goes to show that these patterns are determined by genetics. It's just that the Norwood pattern is the most common one that occurs in men. Why does DHT affect certain hair follicles but not others? Well, there are many reasons. It is known that high DHT levels that stimulate androgen receptors in the hair follicles suppress the WNT-Wnt pathway, which is an important hair growth pathway, as well as affecting other signaling pathways such as the sonic hedgehog pathway, and DHT affects other hormones and growth factors as well, such as prolactin, IGF-1, TGF-beta, and all these factors affected by DHT contribute to hair loss. These are the so-called downstream effects of DHT, and this may sound complex in that there is a lot to hair loss besides just DHT, but in actuality, all these factors are influenced by DHT, and DHT is the weak link that can be attacked directly through the use of 5-AR inhibitors like finasteride. Suppressing DHT will solve all these problems in downstream effects. So, despite this complexity of downstream effects, DHT is the sole culprit in the progression of androgenic alopecia. If you target the DHT, you solve the androgenic alopecia. Simple as that. So sometimes people will ask, if DHT is the sole culprit, then why doesn't suppressing DHT completely reverse hair loss? Well, let's look at the research done on the Dominican Republic's pseudohermaphrodites. There was not a single case of hair loss in anyone whatsoever. Not one case. It's because they had low DHT levels their entire lives. These people were born with low DHT levels, so they never had a chance for androgenic alopecia to start, regardless of whether or not they had the androgenic alopecia gene. The only reason finasteride and dutasteride don't completely reverse hair loss in everybody is because many people start it too late. The evidence shows that the sooner you start finasteride, the more effective the drug is, and if you start it soon enough and stay on the treatment, then it will stop hair loss indefinitely, and I have a video about that which I'll link below. So these questions are not enigmas that researchers are scrambling to find the answers to. There has been much progress on hair loss research over the last few decades, but every treatment that has ever been proven to work or that is currently in development which is theorized to work either treats hair loss by going directly at its source DHT or by going after one of the downstream effects of DHT, like we see in the case of the Wnt pathway stimulant drugs like WAY 316606, or like we see in the case of HMI 115, which is a drug that lowers prolactin levels on the scalp, which is theorized to stop hair loss as well. Although, as some of you guys may know, I think HMI 115 is overhyped, and I'll link my video about it below. So, earlier in the video, Nutritious Library put his standards for quality research aside completely in order to cite garbage papers from Medical Hypotheses and Rob England. Sadly, though, it's about to get even worse.
Now, interestingly enough, there was a theory back in 2008 that was proposed that attempted to answer most, if not all, of these questions. And according to this theory, the primary cause of hair loss isn't necessarily DHT per se, but is initiated rather by the thinning of the scalp, specifically in areas that experience a lot of pressure. And because of this, the scalp tends to begin to express more 5-alpha reductase, not as a means to cause hair loss, but actually to initiate further hair growth in the presence of thinner skin. However, the issue here is that yes, DHT will cause further growth of hair follicles. However, it also causes further thinning of the scalp, which then causes more 5-alpha reductase to be expressed, which causes more thinning of the scalp, which eventually leads to an environment where hair just simply can't grow. Now, I don't know if this is true. To be honest, it's kind of above my pay grade, and it's extremely contended within the science and within the interwebs world.
No, it's not contended. This article is yet another repackaging of the blood flu theory, and the blood flu theory has been debunked soundly by many people, including myself. You look at the vast majority of scams in the hair loss industry today, and you'll notice that almost all of them are just a different variety or repackaging of the blood flu theory. Some people will say it's because of tight muscles, others will say it's because of skull expansion, while others will say it's because of the misalignment of your jaw or because of your posture. But as I already showed earlier, all these theories are completely wrong. And what Neutral Library is presenting here is just another version of this false debunked blood flu theory that refuses to fucking die. So, in this latest recycling of this bullshit theory, thin skin of the scalp starts causing hair loss for some unknown reasons, and then the scalp upregulates 5-AR in order to produce more DHT to counteract this hair loss. But this increased DHT causes more thinning of the scalp, and this leads somehow to more hair loss, and it's a vicious cycle that doesn't stop until you turn into a revenant from doom. So it turns out that the guy who wrote this article is the inventor of a hair loss gimmick which he himself has patented. How it's supposed to work is that it relieves pressure on the scalp in order to prevent the scalp from thinning and improving blood flow somehow. Gee, I wonder where I have seen that thing before. So, this guy came up with this theory and wrote this article to justify selling this bogus product, which is based on an obsolete theory, and he was hoping that by throwing in some gobbledygook about skin thinning, that he could somehow make his fortune while everybody he dupes loses their hair as a consequence of believing all of his bullshit. I have no idea where Nutrition Library even found this article. I mean, maybe he found it in his own nutrition library, but I have to wonder why he even brought this up to begin with. Even he admits that it's not good evidence.
Now, I don't know if this is true. To be honest, it's kind of above my pay grade, and it's extremely contended within the science and within the interwebs world.
This is supposed to be a video about how great DHT is, but according to this guy's theory, DHT actually thins out your skin and turns you into a revenant from doom, and that's going even further than I do in my own video on DHT and skin aging. All kidding aside, I think Nutrient Library is just grasping for straws here because he set out to create this video with a very pro-DHT bias in mind, and he's not paying much concern to the actual quality of the evidence. He's just trying to find anything he possibly can to support his biases.
However, at the heart of the issue is the question of whether or not DHT plays any role whatsoever in male adult biology. And according to the official statement of the NIH, quote, DHT does not play any significant role in the normal physiology of adults.
Fantastic. I guess we're done here. I'd like to thank Nutrafol Library for his contributions to this topic. I know we still disagree on many things, but I am glad we can... Wait a minute, there's still 15 minutes left in this video? Can the credits really be that long? Is this an Ubisoft game I'm playing?
However, when you look at the evidence and you look at the literature, there is a fair amount of literature to the contrary. And so what I want to do in the next portion of this video is walk through that literature.
So he's not done? Fine, go ahead and proceed.
Now, the first place I want to look are at studies where they are investigating the effects of endogenously produced DHT. In this study, the researchers concluded that DHT is responsible for the maintenance of the prostate gland, which does seem to impact semen production even into adulthood.
So this is the first of a whole series of studies he gish-gallops through. He doesn't give any details about the studies, like their study design, their statistical relevance, or any details about the nuances of their outcomes. He's basically just like, hey, you see this study? Cool, let's move on. In the first study he mentions, he implies that lowering DHT levels causes a small prostate and low ejaculate volumes. But what he doesn't mention is that the subjects of the study are 9 pseudohermaphrodites who were born with a 5-AR deficiency, just like the people from the Dr. Imperato's research in the Dominican Republic. These are not people who matured normally into adults and then decide to take a 5-AR blocker. No, these are people who were born with very low DHT levels to begin with, and they had these low DHT levels throughout their fetal development, their childhood, as well as their adolescence. So this lack of DHT affected their prostatic development. So this obviously doesn't apply to people who started finasteride after their prostate was fully developed, as they went through a normal maturation into adult men. Now, It is true that 5-AR blockers can shrink the prostate, and this change in size can slightly affect ejaculatory volume, but it's not dramatic enough to affect fertility. Finasteride isn't birth control after all. Furthermore, this change in ejaculatory volume is usually temporary and will go away on its own with continued use, and will always go away upon the cessation of the drug. Also, preventing the prostate from enlarging has benefits that far outweigh this small risk of reduced ejaculatory volume, especially since an enlarged prostate can cause erectile dysfunction all by itself, in addition to making it much harder to pee. Even in the study, 2 of the subjects who were tested had normal spermatogenesis, leading the investigators to state that, quote, "It appears that DHT does not play a major role in spermatogenesis," unquote. So the study shows that even if finasteride lowers ejaculatory volume, it isn't a substantial enough reduction to influence fertility. So using this point to stress the importance of DHT in adult physiology is really stretching it, since this study doesn't even apply to adults who underwent normal fetal and adolescent development before starting 5-AR blockers, so very likely none of this even applies to anyone watching this video unless you happen to be a pseudohermaphrodite.
And in this study, the researchers concluded that higher DHT levels correspond with higher sexual activity and libido, which does seem to indicate that DHT may play a role in sexual function in adulthood.
Oh no, not this goddamn study again. I have gone over this twice already. The first time I did it was in my hair loss and masturbation video, and the second time was in my April Fool's video, believe it or not, which I'll link below. But in case you don't want to watch those videos, let me do a quick summary as to why this study is completely worthless. What these investigators did was ask 100 Greek military recruits to fill out a survey of how often they had orgasms per week in the previous month, and they asked them to do this on the first day they reported to military duty. On the same day, they drew DHT levels. These guys were 18 to 22 years old, and they weren't keeping a diary about the number of orgasms they had. They were just supposed to estimate based on memory alone. So, supposedly, there was a correlation between DHT levels and the number of orgasms per week, but maybe the real result is that there was a correlation between DHT levels and how much these guys exaggerated their sex life. In reality, I don't think this study showed anything at all. I mean, how many of you guys out there keep a nut log and could answer accurately and honestly how many orgasms you had per week over the previous month? And even if these guys had perfect memories, do you think any of them would admit that they were jacking off 6 times per day? You might as well ask them how often they blew their nose or how often they cleaned their ears over the past month. Most people will not remember such mundane things, since jacking off is such a regular part of your average 18 to 22-year-old's life, especially in Greece, since your average Greek woman looks like this. So it is a really ridiculous study, but it is still pretty funny, and there are other details about it that I won't cover here, so make sure you check out the videos I mentioned where I covered it below if you want to know more about that subject.
And in this study, the researchers concluded that DHT levels are associated with male aggression during adulthood, which does seem to indicate that DHT may play a role in neurological function at some degree during adulthood.
So if you think the previous study had a weird study design, wait till you hear about this study he just showed and accept the conclusions of without any critical analysis. So, in this study, the investigators enrolled 117 men aged 20 to 30, with most of them being college students. Blood work for total testosterone and DHT were drawn, and saliva was tested for testosterone, which supposedly reflected free testosterone levels. The subjects were given a psych test, but actually before the test, in order for them to relax, they were asked to watch a slideshow that showed sexually explicit images, some of which included sexually aggressive images, which you can only imagine what that means. Anyways, unbeknownst to the subjects, they were being recorded, and the time they looked at each image was noted. The investigators then correlated how long each image was looked at versus how disgusting the image was from the point of view of sexual aggression. Who knows, maybe they're watching Two Girls, One Cup. But supposedly, the results of the study show that people with higher DHT levels were more interested in looking at the images with higher degrees of sexual aggression than people with lower DHT levels. This study was from 1987, but it sounds like it could have come from the lab of Joseph Mengele, and that's because this study was downright unethical. The subjects did not consent to being recorded and timed while looking at pornographic images. Crap like this would never fly today. But ethics aside, this is still a completely garbage study. Even the authors conclude that opposite interpretation of the study is possible, meaning the people most interested in the aggressive pictures might have felt more guilty about their impulses and thus avoided looking at the more gross pictures. The authors say, quote, The negative correlation of DHT with this aggression scale indicates that lower levels of DHT go with an inhibition of overt aggression and/or feelings of guilt about being aggressive, unquote. So lower levels of DHT go with either less aggression or more feelings of guilt about being too aggressive. Not only that, the only other study that looked at DHT and aggression in human males, which the authors of the study mentioned, but which Nutting Library didn't mention, probably because they didn't read the study, could not find any, quote, significant relationship between circulating DHT and the aggressive behavior of inpatients at a mental health center, unquote. So, in people locked up in a mental health institution, there is no correlation between DHT levels and aggression. So, I would say based on these studies that there is no good evidence linking DHT with aggression in men. And even if there was a link, that's not even necessarily a good thing. Excessive aggression can cause poor impulse control and lead to things like road rage, which can result in unnecessary violence. There's a good reason why bars are staffed by bouncers, and it is because alcohol can increase aggression and lead to acts of violence even over the most trivial of bullshit. So being able to keep your cool and avoid aggression is something that a lot of men would benefit from. And in any case, none of this research proves anything one way or the other, so it is a completely moot point.
And then in this study, the researchers concluded that DHT may mediate some certain aspects of cognition through DHT's metabolism into various neurosteroids.
My neurosteroids! I swear, 99% of people who freak out about neurosteroids didn't even know what neurosteroids were before they Googled Finasteride. I've made several dozen videos dispelling this myth completely, and I'll link my entire neurosteroid video series below, but let's try to address this study. So, Nutty Library gives the impression that all the studies he's presenting are human studies of DHT, but this particular study is a rat study. The investigators looked at the effects of testosterone, DHT, and 3-alpha-androstenediol, which is a testosterone and DHT metabolite, on rat behavior and on rat neurons. All three hormones were injected into these rats, and all three of them had effects on rat behavior and nerve function. However, since all three of these hormones are androgens, it's not surprising that exogenous androgens have effects on behavior, but that doesn't tell us anything about what natural physiological levels of these hormones do in the human body. We already know that supplementing any androgen, whether it is testosterone or DHT, can have an effect on your body and on your mood. That's just a non-specific androgen effect that all these supplemental hormones happen to have. But again, we are not talking about DHT supplementation. We are talking about natural physiological levels of DHT, and you can't use a rat study where the rodents were given supplemental DHT to determine the effects of natural DHT levels in human beings. You couldn't even use a human study to determine this because this is supplemental DHT, not natural DHT we're talking about here. DHT simps seem to keep forgetting that the DHT your body produces naturally is not the same as taking freaking steroids. Natural DHT levels are far too low and thus work as a paracrine hormone, as even Natty Library himself said earlier in the video. This study is a complete nothing burger. If he had taken the time to critically analyze this study, he'd know it was worthless, but instead he just dropped it and just expected us all to accept its conclusions. That's not how research works. Scientific studies are not gospel. If you can't explain why the study is a good study, don't even bother bringing it up at all. Let's move on.
Now, all of these studies are simply association studies and doesn't necessarily mean that DHT per se is causing these effects. It may just be simply a correlation with testosterone levels. Men that typically have higher DHT levels also have higher testosterone levels, and so this may just simply be an association with testosterone and DHT and these different biological effects.
Okay, then why did you bother bringing up any of this research at all then? Is this really the best thing you've got to prove your point that DHT is important in adult men? Damn.
However, it is certainly possible that DHT does play some sort of role in adult male biology. And this idea is further evidenced by men that are given exogenous DHT.
Okay, so he's basically given up on trying to show us evidence that natural physiologic levels of DHT are important, so he's moved on to DHT supplementation, which is a straw man argument, since literally nobody disagrees that DHT supplementation can have a potent effect on the human body. DHT is, after all, a very powerful androgenic steroid, and since it is closely related to testosterone, if you take it exogenously to give yourself supraphysiological levels of DHT, it will have a potent androgenic effect on the human body, just like you'd expect to happen if somebody were to take any anabolic androgenic steroid. So, this next data doesn't have anything to do with natural DHT levels, but let's take a look at what he's showing us here anyways.
In this study in particular, where the men were given exogenous DHT, the researchers concluded that, quote, "We conclude that 3 months treatment with transdermal dihydrotestosterone gel demonstrated expected androgenic effects, short-term safety, and limited improvement in lower limb muscle strength, but no change in physical functioning or cognitive function."
So this first study he mentions took 33 men over 60 years old with low testosterone levels and randomized them to get either DHT gel or a placebo gel. After 3 months of treatment, DHT levels increased, but at the same time, free testosterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone decreased. There was no effect on serum hormone-binding globulin or estradiol from the DHT treatment. The subjects receiving DHT had increased muscle strength with no change in their cognitive function. So, this is what you would expect if you gave any older man with low testosterone levels any androgen. If you gave them regular testosterone exogenously, you get the same results on muscle strength. So all the study proves is that DHT is an androgen. And since DHT is similar to testosterone, it is sometimes used in testosterone replacement therapy, but that's a completely different topic altogether. If you were to ask my opinion on using DHT for TRT, I'd say it is a bad idea since DHT causes hair loss and enlarged prostate in addition to many other health problems. So I'd say it's much safer and more effective to just use testosterone with a 5-AR inhibitor. But again, we are getting off topic here, but it's not my fault because National Library keeps on bringing up research that pertains to DHT supplementation in hypogonadal men, which has nothing at all to do with natural DHT production.
And then in this study, the researchers concluded that the results suggest that beneficial changes in cognition can occur in hypogonadal men using testosterone placement levels and DHT treatment, and these changes in cognition can be reliably measured during a relative steady state dose level. Further, our results suggest that aromatization of testosterone into estrogen may regulate verbal memory in men, whereas non-aromatizable androgens like DHT may regulate spatial memory. The authors go on to conclude that because DHT cannot be aromatized into estrogen, the improvement in spatial memory is likely a direct androgenic effect rather than an indirect effect from an increase in estrogen. A significant decrease in testosterone levels was also observed, suggesting that DHT may have effects on cognition independent of testosterone.
So this next study looked at hypogonadal men who received either testosterone gel or DHT gel. This was not a huge study since only 12 men received testosterone and only 9 men received DHT gel. So unlike the previous study we just looked at, in this study, both testosterone and DHT did improve cognitive function somewhat. Also, unlike in the previous study, DHT did lower estrogen levels in this study. But it is ridiculous to conclude with such a tiny number of hypogonadal subjects using supplemental androgens that testosterone specifically improves verbal memory and DHT improves spatial memory. Things like spatial and verbal memory are not well understood to begin with, and a study with only 21 men receiving 2 different supplemental androgens is certainly not adequate enough to answer such a profoundly complicated question. Even the researchers hedge their bets and say the results just suggest that testosterone and DHT may have these effects. And again, we're just talking about supplementation here, and since natural testosterone levels are so much higher than natural DHT levels, these spatial and verbal memory benefits, if they even exist at all, would much more likely apply to testosterone rather than DHT.
And then in this study, the researchers concluded that, quote, transdermal administration of DHT improves sexual function and may be a useful alternative for androgen replacement. As estrogens are thought to play a role in the pathogenesis of prostate hyperplasia, DHT may be beneficial compared with aromatizing androgens in the treatment of aging men.
So once again, DHT supplementation in older hypogonadal men can be used in place of testosterone supplementation to improve sexual function. Cool story, bro, but what does this have to do with natural DHT levels? Remember, even you said DHT as it exists naturally has a paracrine effect on the body, not endocrine. And I agree, because DHT levels as they exist naturally are far too low to be able to do anything that testosterone can't already do better.
And in this study, the researchers found that there was an improvement in libido in men that received exogenous DHT, an increase in lean body mass, a decrease in fat mass, and improvements in spatial cognition and mood.
So Nutrition Library totally took this paper out of context. I don't even think he read it. First of all, this isn't even a study. It's just an editorial. If you read further than the first few paragraphs, you'll see that the author is actually concerned about the use of DHT for TRT. This is because the decrease in estrogen with DHT may actually be a bad thing. The article says, quote, "The decrease in estrogen levels is not without concern. In view of the well-known role of estrogens in bone metabolism, as is evident in patients with estrogen resistance or aromatase deficiency who show significant osteopenia and delayed epiphyseal closure. Moreover, in elderly men, the correlation of bone mineral density is much stronger with estradiol than with testosterone, indicating a role for estradiol in maintaining bone mass." Unquote. In fact, the author of this editorial concludes that DHT should not be recommended as a form of TRT in older men. He says, quote, "As to the effect on the central nervous system, it seems that the effects of testosterone on cognitive functions are mediated via estradiol formed locally. Hence, whether DHT will have similar effects as testosterone on cognitive functions remains unknown. In conclusion, available data so far does not support the use of DHT in preference over testosterone in elderly men." Unquote. So in other words, the author of this editorial agrees with me that DHT is a trash hormone, not just as it exists in the body, but even in the case of supplementation, because it has far more risk compared to testosterone, and that is probably why DHT's use in TRT is rare.
And this study found that men given DHT had an increase in hemoglobin levels, an increase in serum creatine levels, an increase in lean mass, but a decrease in fat mass.
Now, this study is pretty much the same as all the others, but Nascent Library, he totally skims over another downside of DHT's use in TRT, and that is the fact that DHT gel had a negative effect on the bone mineral density of the spine. That's right, DHT caused osteoporosis of the spine, which is exactly what the previous article was warning about. So even if you are a hypogonadal man who is interested in going on TRT, you are much, much better off using testosterone instead of DHT, since DHT lowers estrogen, which is important for bone mineral density, even in men.
Now, one of the reasons I find these studies to be so interesting is that, yes, it's interesting that DHT given to these men did improve things like libido and mood and cognition and even things like muscle mass in some of those studies. But the real reason these are so interesting is because when you give men DHT, it completely crushes testosterone production. And so the big question here is, why is it that when you give men DHT, a hormone that's not supposed to be responsible for any of those functions and actually destroys the hormone that is supposed to be responsible for things like libido and mood and muscle mass, why is it that these men are experiencing these benefits?
There's no mystery here at all. We already know that DHT is a stronger androgen than testosterone, and the only reason testosterone is dominant in the body is because your body produces a lot more of it. It's also because testosterone is an endocrine hormone that has effects on all tissues in the body, whereas DHT is a paracrine hormone that just has effects where it is produced, like the scalp and the prostate. So, if you give someone a large amount of an exogenous androgen like DHT, your natural testosterone production will shut down. That is why steroid users have to go on post-cycle therapy in order to recover their natural androgen levels. But the reason DHT causes a shutdown is because DHT, when it is taken in very high doses, can effectively fill the role of testosterone, and this isn't even unique to DHT. If you supplement testosterone, it will also shut down your natural testosterone production. So even steroid users who are on a testosterone-only cycle will still need to go on a PCT by using compounds like Clomid and Nolvadex to restart their natural testosterone production, and they will use HCG to keep testosterone going during a steroid cycle. All Nominal Library is doing here is proving that DHT is an androgen that will have greater androgenic effects beyond what it does naturally when you take supraphysiological doses of the chemical. So who cares? We already know that.
And so keeping this in mind, I do want to also look at some studies that were specifically looking into the side effect profiles of finasteride and dutasteride. And in this study in particular, the researchers concluded that, quote, both finasteride and dutasteride were similarly associated with depression with a constant risk over time, while neither drug was associated with suicide. Prescribing clinicians and potential users should be aware of the possible risk for depression associated with 5-alpha reductase use.
Remember at the beginning of this video when I said this guy isn't a DHT simp, he's just DHT curious? Well, I take that back now. He is a DHT simp because he's now officially fear-mongering about 5-AR inhibiting drugs. So the article he quotes is one I actually did an entire video on last year, which I'll link below. Let me be perfectly clear though, finasteride and dutasteride do not cause depression and suicide, and the research he is quoting is both flawed and misleading, as I demonstrate in my video. The study, it was a retrospective Swedish database study that looked at men over 50 years of age who were prescribed finasteride or dutasteride for benign prostatic hyperplasia between 2005 and 2018. The biggest flaw with this study is that the people who were treated with 5-AR blocking drugs were a sicker group of people to begin with than the people not on these drugs. Not only did they have BPH, which itself can cause sexual dysfunction leading to depression, but the group on these drugs also had a higher incidence of diabetes and high blood pressure. So these groups of subjects were not comparable, since people with medical diseases like BPH, diabetes, and high blood pressure can certainly have a higher incidence of depression without blaming the 5-AR blockers as a cause of it. So this study isn't convincing at all, and the FDA is not convinced either, since even though Merck, who are the manufacturers of finasteride, added depression to the package insert, the FDA did not feel that the data suggesting that finasteride increases the risk of depression and suicide was justified.
And in this study, the researchers concluded that, quote, sexual adverse effects such as decreased libido, erectile dysfunction, and a decreased ejaculate have been reported in as many as 3.6 to 15.8% of men.
So he totally cherry-picked the data in this study, because the very next sentence says that side effects are mild and usually go away with continued treatment. Also, nobody denies that finasteride has a small risk of causing sexual side effects, but this probably has nothing to do with DHT, otherwise everybody would get side effects. Finasteride lowers serum DHT levels by 70% after all, and if you were to lower testosterone levels that much, you'd practically become a woman. So clearly, finasteride side effects are caused by other issues besides DHT. It isn't known exactly why finasteride causes side effects, but the most plausible theory is that since finasteride raises testosterone levels slightly, that extra bit of testosterone could aromatize into estrogen, hence why people get sexual side effects from the drug sometimes. The increase in testosterone from 5-AR inhibitors, though, is far too low for that to be an issue in most people, which is why the overwhelming majority of finasteride users do not experience any sexual side effects at all, and even if they do, they usually go away with continued use, as this article says here. Furthermore, finasteride is not a very dose-dependent drug, so even if you do get side effects from it, you can mitigate them by reducing your dose of the drug. Even doses of finasteride as small as just 0.1 milligrams of the drug daily can still be effective, and I talk about that in my optimal dose of finasteride video, which I'll link below. Point is though, side effects from finasteride are rare, they're not caused by low DHT, and even if you get them, there are ways to work around them, so this fear-mongering is not justified.
And in this study, the researchers concluded that the use of 5-alpha reductase inhibitors carried a 1.57-fold risk of sexual dysfunction and a relative risk of 1.66 for finasteride and 1.37 for dutasteride. And in this study, the researchers concluded that, quote, overall, 5-alpha reductase inhibitors determine an increased risk of hypoactive sexual desire and erectile dysfunction.
So he throws in 2 more review articles for good measure on the side effects of 5-AR inhibitors. Again, no one, especially not me, is denying that these drugs have a small risk of side effects. He is bringing up relative risk ratios, which can be misleading. Most of the time, we are more interested in absolute risk, not relative risk. For example, if a relative risk is 2 and the risk in the placebo group of a side effect is, say, 1.5%, then that means the risk in the drug group is 3%. So the absolute risk difference is 3 minus 1.5, which is 1.5%. So he's quoting a lot of numbers, but the important thing to take away is that the absolute risk of getting side effects from finasteride or dutasteride is actually very low. In most studies, we're talking about an absolute risk of just 2%, which is consistent with the original clinical research.
And then there's this study where the authors found changes in the androgen receptor density and the nerve density in the genitals of individuals that experienced long-term finasteride side effects.
So having run out of options in his crusade to validate his DHT simping, he brings up the ultimate trump card he can think of, a post-finasteride syndrome study. Unfortunately for him though, I am a veteran at debunking these bullshit studies, which is why I have an entire video series dedicated to debunking post-finasteride syndrome, which I'll link below. So I know all the weaknesses of all these studies, including this one, so let's go ahead and get into it. This particular study recruited 8 men, including 3 from the Propecia Help Forum. These people had erectile dysfunction that they claimed had persisted for at least 6 months after stopping finasteride, and they blamed this all on finasteride. So already, we have major issues of selection bias here. The subjects had biopsies done on their penile foreskin, and the results were compared to 11 otherwise healthy control subjects who had foreskin biopsies for a condition called phimosis. Anyways, the investigators found more androgen receptors in the skin of the supposed PFS subjects than in the control subjects. But this result does not show that the erectile dysfunction in these men was due specifically to finasteride use. It is common for men with erectile dysfunction from any cause to have low testosterone levels, and androgen receptor density will increase to compensate for this. In the study, total testosterone and free testosterone were indeed lower in the PFS group than in the control group, though the differences were not statistically significant, which is probably because the numbers of subjects was very low, only 8 of them in the PFS group. So ED is a very common problem. Even in young men, it is fairly common for people to have this condition, and these people claiming to have PFS could very well have gotten ED from causes which were totally unrelated from finasteride use, since erectile dysfunction is a highly multifactorial condition and it can even occur spontaneously. If this study was a serious study, which of course it isn't, the investigators would have compared the biopsies from the PFS subjects to subjects who had ED but who had never taken finasteride in order to see if there were any statistical differences. The fact that there were differences between the PFS biopsies and biopsies from normal subjects doesn't prove anything, and this is very typical of PFS research in general. The studies always have a very small number of subjects who are drawn from finasteride-hating communities like Propecia Help, and the studies never have an appropriate control group. This is probably done on purpose, since these studies are usually funded by anti-finasteride organizations like the PFS Network.
Now, again, it's not exactly clear whether or not the side effects that are associated with finasteride and dutasteride are caused by these drugs or are simply an association. It is entirely possible that men that are prone to male pattern baldness and prone to prostate issues are also prone to issues with libido, issues with mood disorders, and the such.
So that's a great point. I agree with you on this one, and it makes perfect sense to me, especially if you think about mood disorders, since going bald can make you pretty unhappy in life. In fact, there's even strong objective evidence that going bald can ruin your life, and I made a video about that which I'll link below. Bottom line though is, like he said, there is no strong evidence of causation, and these adverse effects could very well just be associative, especially since things like depression and erectile dysfunction are all very common across the general population.
However, with all things considered, when you look at the research in men that are producing DHT endogenously, coupled with the evidence of men that are given exogenous DHT, it does appear that DHT does play some sort of minor role in things like libido, sexual function, mood, as well as cognitive function.
Nope, you didn't prove any of that. Sorry, son. You did a good job talking about the biochemistry at the beginning of the video, but you were only able to quote a few studies backing up your claim that natural DHT levels have an important physiologic role in the body other than destroying our hair and enlarging our prostate glands. And I already pointed out the immense flaws of those studies. You then quoted some studies on the effects of supplemental DHT, which has nothing to do with natural physiologic levels of DHT, as I've said a million times at this point. Finally, you quoted some studies showing that 5-AR blockers can cause side effects, but you did nothing to prove that those side effects are due to decreased DHT levels, and in fact, this has never been proven. It's more likely these side effects from DHT blockers are due to other hormonal effects, like an increase in estrogen from testosterone aromatization, which is rare to begin with. I think you set out to do this video with the intention of making DHT look as good as you possibly can, so you deliberately avoided going in depth with this research in hopes we just accept your conclusions, but I actually did look at the research you provided, and nothing you cited came anywhere even remotely close to qualifying any of your beliefs about DHT. I am sorry, Nitro Library, but your video has failed, and DHT is still a trash hormone.
My only point of this video is to outline my reasoning as to why I believe endogenously produced DHT does have some level of positive benefit in men. And because of this, I want to spend the rest of this video talking about natural ways to augment the natural production of DHT.
No. I'm not going to touch that shit with a 10-foot pole. I will say, though, that there really is no good evidence that any natural supplement can increase DHT levels to a point where it has more than a paracrine effect as it does naturally. I say this because if anything he lists could actually raise DHT levels so high to the point where DHT becomes endocrine instead of just paracrine, then we'd likely have seen case reports by now of women taking such supplements and then developing virilizing features like a deep voice, male pattern baldness, and facial hair development. So any increase in DHT these supplements cause is likely going to be negligible and probably won't matter that much if you're on a 5-AR inhibitor, since you're still going to be suppressing way more DHT than any of these supplements could possibly produce. So I think I'm going to end it there. I mean, I don't know why Nutrition Library is so obsessed with the idea of promoting DHT, but from what I understand, the guy's educational background is in dietetics, and nothing against that, of course, as that is an important field of education, but I have noticed that a lot of nutrition gurus tend to hold this belief that food is medicine, and that virtually all health problems can be solved by changing your diet. Certainly, improving your diet can solve a lot of health problems, but diet isn't everything. Because of this, I notice a lot of these food is medicine types of people take a contrarian stance on health, so in that regard, it makes sense he'd take a contrarian stance on DHT and claim it is important when the mainstream position is that it doesn't really have an importance in adult human physiology. But nothing personal against this guy, we just have a disagreement on DHT, but I hope that if he does cover the subject again, he does so without these preconceived notions about DHT's supposed benefits. I also hope he actually takes the time to critically analyze the studies he presents in more depth, rather than just post a paragraph or two from them and then expect us just to accept the conclusions. I mean, that's not scientific. I mean, it is too bad, because if he made this video without the idea of making a pro-DHT video, then I really think it could have been a lot better. It could have even been excellent. But anyways, I think I'm done. So I'll see you next time, my fellow hair loss witchers. Thanks for watching. God bless.